The house was silent, the darkness enveloping every corner as Leah tiptoed down the hall toward her nephew Kyle's room. Her heart raced, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She knew this was wrong, but the thought of what she was about to do only heightened her desire. There was no denying the magnetic pull that had grown between them. Each glance, every accidental touch had built up an unbearable tension, and tonight, she wasn't going to resist it any longer. She gently pushed the door open, holding her breath as she peeked inside. The room was dim, illuminated only by the soft moonlight streaming through the curtains, casting shadows across the bed where Kyle lay. He looked so peaceful, sprawled on his back with one arm draped lazily over his head, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Leah's gaze lingered on him, her pulse quickening as she took in every detail, the strong lines of his shoulders, the way his shirt clung to his chest, and the faint hint of stubble along his jaw. She bit her lip, fighting the urge to retreat. But something deeper, something primal, kept her rooted to the spot. Her eyes traveled down his body, following the shape of him beneath the sheets, and a rush of heat flooded her. No, she wasn't turning back. Not now. Quietly, she slipped inside, closing the door softly behind her. She hesitated at the foot of his bed, just watching him for a moment. Then, slowly, she climbed onto the mattress, her movements careful and deliberate as she settled beside him. She leaned in closer, her breath warm against his ear as she whispered his name. Kyle, she breathed softly, her voice low and seductive. He stirred slightly, his head turning in her direction, but he didn't wake. Leah's heart pounded wildly. The thrill of seeing him like this, completely unaware of what she was doing, sent a shiver down her spine. She lowered herself further, her lips hovering just inches from his cheek, and pressed a feather-like kiss to his skin. He murmured softly in his sleep, his lips parting as if responding to her touch, and Leah's breath hitched. Slowly, she trailed her lips along his jaw, her kisses growing bolder as she moved down to his neck. The feel of his warm skin beneath her mouth, the faint scent of him, made her head spin. She couldn't resist sliding her hand up his chest, her fingers teasingly tracing the contours of his muscles. He shifted beneath her, his brow furrowing slightly, but still he didn't wake. Encouraged, Leah leaned closer, her body pressing lightly against his as she kissed the side of his neck, her tongue flicking out to taste him. The sensation made him shudder, his breathing hitching, and she smiled against his skin. "Kyle," she whispered again, her voice a sultry murmur. "Wake up." His eyes fluttered open slowly, still glazed with sleep, and he blinked up at her, confusion flickering in his gaze as he tried to process what was happening. "Aunt Leah," he murmured, his voice thick and groggy. "What are you?" But before he could finish, she silenced him with a kiss, soft and tender at first, then deeper, more demanding. Kyle stiffened, his eyes widening in shock, but Leah didn't pull away. She could feel the way his body responded to her, could sense the way his hesitation melted away as his lips began to move against hers. "Sure," she whispered, breaking the kiss just long enough to murmur against his mouth, her hands sliding up to cup his face. "Just let me, just this once." Kyle let out a low, helpless groan, his hands coming up to grip her waist as if he couldn't help himself. Leah took that as her cue to continue, kissing him harder, pouring every ounce of pent-up desire into the kiss. His resistance crumbled, and suddenly his hands were everywhere, sliding up her back, tangling in her hair, pulling her closer as he kissed her back with the hunger that matched her own. Leah's heart raced as she felt him shift beneath her, his body arching up to meet hers. The feel of him, hard and hot beneath her, made her gasp softly, and she couldn't stop herself from grinding against him, her movements slow and sensual. Kyle's grip tightened on her hips, a desperate sound escaping his throat as he buried his face in her neck, his breath coming out in harsh, ragged gasps. "Aunt Leah, we shouldn't," he murmured, his voice strained. But his words were lost as she kissed him again, her tongue slipping past his lips to tangle with his. He groaned, his hands sliding down to her thighs, and Leah shivered as his touch sent jolts of electricity through her. "Don't think," she whispered, her lips brushing against his ear. "Just feel." And then she kissed him again, her hands roaming over his body as if trying to memorize every inch of him. She felt him shudder beneath her, felt the way his body responded to her touch, and it only made her bolder. Slowly, she slid her hand beneath his shirt, her fingers trailing over his bare skin, and Kyle let out a low, helpless moan. "Leah," he breathed, his voice a strained whisper. But he didn't push her away. Instead, his hands moved over her body, exploring her curves, his touch hesitant at first, then growing more confident as he realized she wasn't going to stop him. Leah arched against him, her breath coming out in soft, breathless gasps as his hands slid up her sides, his fingers brushing lightly over her ribs. The feel of him, the way he touched her, made her head spin. She leaned down, her lips trailing over his collarbone, her tongue flicking out to taste him. Kyle's hands tightened on her waist, his body trembling beneath her, and Leah couldn't stop herself from pressing closer, her hips rocking against his in a slow, sensual rhythm. "Aunt Leah, please," he groaned, his voice desperate. But whether he was begging her to stop or keep going, she didn't know. All she knew was that she couldn't stop now. Not when he felt so good beneath her, not when she could feel the way his body responded to her. Slowly, Leah kissed her way back up to his mouth, her hands sliding over his chest as she kissed him deeply, passionately. Kyle moaned into her mouth, his hands roaming over her body, and Leah shivered as his touch sent shivers down her spine. This was wrong, so very, very wrong, but in that moment she didn't care. All that mattered was the way he made her feel. Leah's heart hammered wildly in her chest as she felt Kyle's lips part beneath hers, his resistance fading completely. His hands roamed over her back, slipping under her shirt and grazing her skin, the sensation making her gasp softly into his mouth. She kissed him deeper, her tongue sliding against his as she pressed her body closer to his, feeling the heat of him through the thin fabric of his clothes. She could sense his hesitation, the way his fingers trembled slightly as they explored her curves. But every time he tried to pull away, even for a second, Leah captured his mouth again, kissing him harder, deeper, until he was left breathless and trembling beneath her. The taste of him was intoxicating, driving her wild with need, and she couldn't stop her hands from wandering, couldn't resist sliding her fingers down to the hem of his shirt and pushing it up, exposing the smooth skin of his abdomen. "Kyle," she murmured against his lips, her voice low and husky. "I've wanted this for so long." He shuddered, his breath coming out in a ragged gasp as Leah leaned down, her lips trailing along his neck. She felt his pulse racing beneath her mouth, felt the way his body tensed as her hands moved over him, caressing every inch of bare skin she could reach. He was so warm, so strong, and the feel of him, the taste of him, made her head spin. "Aunt Leah, we can't," he whispered, his voice strained, but the way his hands tightened on her waist, the way his body arched up against hers, told a different story. He didn't want her to stop. Not really. "Don't fight it," she whispered back, her lips brushing against his ear. "Just let yourself feel." And then she kissed him again, her hands sliding up his chest, pushing his shirt higher until he lifted his arms and let her pull it off completely. Leah tossed it aside, her eyes darkening as she took in the sight of him, his broad shoulders, the defined muscles of his chest and stomach, the way his skin glistened faintly in the moonlight. He was beautiful, every inch of him, and she couldn't resist leaning down, her lips brushing lightly over his collarbone, then lower, kissing her way down his chest. Kyle groaned, his hands tangling in her hair as she kissed him, his body trembling beneath her touch. Leah smiled against his skin, her tongue flicking out to trace the lines of his muscles, savoring the way he shivered in response. She kissed lower down to his stomach, her hands sliding over his sides, feeling the way his muscles tensed beneath her fingers. "Aunt Leah, please," he murmured, his voice a breathless plea. But Leah didn't stop. She kissed her way back up, her hands roaming over his chest, his shoulders then sliding down to his hips as she straddled him, her body pressing against his in a way that made both of them gasp. "Does this feel wrong?" she whispered, her lips brushing against his ear. She rocked her hips against him, the slow, sensual movement making him groan softly. "Yes. I mean no. I don't know," he stammered, his hands gripping her waist as if he didn't know whether to pull her closer or push her away. "Just let go, Kyle," Leah murmured, her voice soft and seductive. She leaned down, her lips capturing his in a deep, lingering kiss, her hands sliding up to cup his face as she kissed him again and again, each kiss more passionate, more desperate than the last. Kyle's resolve crumbled completely. He kissed her back with a hunger that matched her own, his hands sliding up her back, pulling her closer as he rolled them over, pinning her beneath him. Leah gasped softly, her heart racing as he looked down at her, his eyes dark and filled with a desire she'd never seen before. "Aunt Leah, I can't stop," he murmured, his voice low and raw. "Then don't," she whispered back, her hands sliding up to tangle in his hair. "Don't stop." And then he was kissing her again, his mouth hot and demanding against hers as his hands moved over her body, touching, exploring, as if he couldn't get enough of her. Leah arched beneath him, her body trembling as his hands slid down to her thighs, pushing up her skirt, his fingers brushing lightly over her bare skin. "Kyle," she gasped softly, her hands gripping his shoulders as he kissed his way down her neck, his lips trailing over her collarbone, then lower. The feel of his mouth on her skin, the heat of his body pressed against hers, was almost too much to bear. Every touch, every kiss sent jolts of electricity through her, making her head spin. "I want you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her hands sliding down his back, pulling him closer. "I want you so much." Kyle groaned, his hands tightening on her thighs as he kissed her again, his mouth hot and insistent against hers. Leah could feel the tension between them building, could feel the way his body responded to hers, and it only made her want him more. She slid her hands down to the waistband of his pants, her fingers trembling slightly as she began to unbutton them, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. "Kyle," she whispered again, her voice a low, breathless murmur. "Please." He looked down at her, his eyes dark and intense, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then slowly he leaned down, his lips brushing lightly against hers in a kiss so soft, so tender it made her heart ache. "I want you too," he whispered back, his voice low and strained. And then he kissed her again, his hands sliding over her body, touching her, caressing her, as if he couldn't get enough of her. Leah's breath hitched as his hands moved lower, his touch sending shivers down her spine. She arched against him, her body trembling with anticipation, and when his fingers finally brushed against her most sensitive spot, she gasped, her hands gripping his shoulders as a wave of pleasure washed over her. "Kyle," she moaned softly, her voice a desperate plea. And then everything else faded away, the world, the consequences, everything but the feel of him, the way he touched her, the way he made her feel. In that moment, nothing else mattered. All that mattered was him and her, tangled together in a forbidden embrace, their bodies moving in perfect sync as they gave in to the desire that had been building between them for so long.